I'm an architect easily distracted by other subjects. And although I work full time as an architect, I managed to squeeze into that being a part time philosopher and an occasional activist. And it's those two hats I will wear today. So, presenting part philosophy, part manifesto. So, it doesn't take much persuasion to agree that the average Indian city is plagued by dysfunction on multiple counts, as you can see from these images here. And this is actually due to a lack of history in India of having empowered local government. When the constitution was written, for reasons I don't have the time to go into, we only recognized central and state government and directed state governments to set up local governments. And in 1992, realizing that local governments were not functioning at all because there was excessive interference by state governments, we passed these two constitutional amendments, the 73rd for rural areas and the 74th for urban areas. The amendments were broad and had to be implemented by state governments framing enabling acts and rules, which was actually a mistake. It's like asking the fox to write the rules of the chicken coop. So, technical changes have been made, and in some cases, constitutional provisions ignored, and the status quo prior to the amendments effectively continues. Because of this lack of awareness about the importance of local government, there's a large, high degree of apathy to what local politics can do. And Bangalore offers an interesting case study for that apathy. So, we haven't had an elected municipal government for over 5 years now, and fresh elections are yet to be held. City is managed by state government and bureaucrats. The validity of the master plan expired almost 11 years ago, and preparation of a new master plan is yet to begin. Despite this vacuum, major infrastructure projects and an initial estimate of 76,000 crores, which is several times the BBMP, the erstwhile BBMP budget, are being pushed through at a very rapid pace. And we've had a recent restructuring in the Greater Bangalore Governance Act, which splits the city into 5 municipalities and an overarching body called the Greater Bangalore Authority, which in my mind and the mind of many activists violates the principles of democratic oversight established by the 74th Amendment to the Constitution. Now let's think of what this would be if the same thing happened at the central government equivalent. It would mean the term of the Lok Sabha expired 5 years ago and the country was governed by politicians not elected for the purpose and by bureaucrats. All democratic frameworks for policy and budgeting expired over 10 years ago, and no new frameworks have been done to replace them. And yet, we are launching major infrastructure projects of value greater than the union budget. And we were implementing new governance frameworks that violate basic constitutional principles. Now, if this had happened, there would be an outcry saying murder of democracy, collapse of governance. Yet it passes without much notice at the local government level. And in some ways, this is more troubling than the inertia of the entrenched power systems that are distorting the system. The fact that we don't seem to be concerned about it. So, how should we imagine this relationship between citizens and municipal government? Now, first, you should realize why local government is important, because it is the first and most accessible level of public political engagement. It can be scaled down to the local neighborhood level and therefore tied to the routines of daily life. And this is important for our doctrine of human rights because rights are defined at the national level in a constitution, but they must be negotiated and claimed within the routines of daily life. So, unless we imagine the city as a space of human rights, we're not going to make much progress as a constitutional republic. So, how do we construct citizen engagement at this level, given the inertia of entrenched power structures and also the apathy we find? So, for that, I need to tell you a story of someone you have probably never heard about, this gentleman called Ledru Rollin, who was a French labor activist and lawyer during the French Revolution, played some minor role there. In fact, I've been telling this story for years, but all this time I thought it was a joke and it wasn't true. And only a few months ago, a historian friend who read a piece that I'd written where I cited it said, no, it's true. And this is the guy it happened to. So I came to know about this guy only recently. And the story is during the French Revolution, he was sitting in a cafe having a cup of coffee, and a mob rushed past on the street, and he abandoned his coffee and ran after them, shouting, I have to catch up with those people. I am their leader. So, so what lesson does this story tell us? Now, there's meant to be a relationship between citizen and state, but the state is not interested in change. So when some of our citizens who are interested in change, we tend to primarily stay within this vertical axis connecting citizen and state. And we lobby the state through petitions, protests, public interest, litigation, etc. But there's an asymmetry of power weighted in favor of the state. So it's always a struggle to pursue this. Now, what the Ledru-Rollin story tells us that we should first focus on the lateral axes that connect citizens without involving the state. And when you build a certain mass of citizens that are connected by this lateral axis, then it's easier to, which these connections are easier to achieve when the state is not in the picture. And then you build this mass that the state has to notice, and that can be the basis for a more productive relationship. So what should shape this lateral axis is largely what I'll be talking about today. And this is a challenge given the scale of the city and the intense diversity and complexity it contains. So we actually have to first understand what we mean by a city, how we imagine it. Because our unity as citizens, even of a nation, is that we are an imagined community. And this happens at the scale of a city also. So we need to think about the nature of metropolitan life. And this is why I will be rather philosophical to start with, because I believe this philosophy is necessary. Otherwise, we might just rush down unproductive paths unless we have our philosophy right. Now, the problem is we have no imagination of the city in India. We see it only as a technical issue. We locate the roots of history and culture in the village or in myth, and we see the city only as a technical system to be engineered. And you see this bias in the way building bylaws are framed. This is an excerpt from Bengaluru's bylaws, but it follows a reference model framed by the National Building Code. And we see similar approaches in cities across India, where what you can build is the product of a mathematical formula that derives from the land use zoning, the size of the plot, and the width of the accessing road. There is no attempt to comprehend neighborhood character or to acknowledge that precincts of a city are shaped by history, culture, topography, and a host of other cultures. This creates an urban planning approach solely devoted to solving problems of land use and logistics. The public realm is not seen as cultural, political, historical, or ecological. It is conceived purely as transactional, devoted to offering to the persons within it the prosaic functions of movement, consumption, entertainment, and leisure. So citizen engagement tends to also focus on these functional issues such as traffic congestion, flooding, potholes, service availability, etc. And the problem with such engagement is it tends to be stratified by class and location, and it tends to be project specific rather than conceptualizing the city. So consequently, development efforts tend to focus on aesthetic symbols that act as metaphors for development. So large infrastructure projects, glossy buildings, etc. And significant underlying systems that lack the visibility of large projects receive little attention. So the goal becomes to construct islands of promise sufficient to attract capital and investment, even if these islands exist within a sea of dysfunction. And these aesthetic symbols of development are posited as a proper order of the city, proper order, and this tends to be accepted by all, even by those marginalized by the model. I remember one activist telling me they went to meet the chief minister and said, you don't need flyovers, you just need something where you just sort out the road standards and synchronize signals and all that. And immediately lost interest as soon as he heard that there were no major projects to be done. Now, this creates a crisis of recognition. The master plan with the land use map as its core poses as a holistic conception of the city. Now, the problem is land markets in India are notoriously inefficient, for they are riddled with bureaucracy, opacity, and corruption. I'm sure everyone in this room has encountered that in some form. Now, any introductory class in economics will teach you that price is determined at the point at which supply and demand curves intersect. And in inefficient markets, the supply curve is extremely steep, which means that even slight escalations in demand cause disproportionate increases in prices. So it's reached a stage where land price bears no relationship with median income in the Indian city. Now, for the system to recognize your presence in the city, you must have some form of contract, whether formal or informal, that ties you to a parcel of land designated by the official land use plan. But disproportionate prices set a very high threshold of affordability. And if you go through the numbers, you'll find close to half the population falls below this threshold. So they are thus forced into an informal existence outside the master plan, causing a significant percentage of urbanism to be within slums, unregulated layouts, unregulated construction. We cannot condemn the informal sector by casting it as choosing the blameworthy option of not following legality, for it is legality itself which produces informality. They have no choice. And they survive because master planning is weak in both ideation and implementation, thus granting them space for the informal structures of tenure that underpin their survival. This, however, condemns them to degraded environments of poor service availability, leaving them vulnerable to exploitation and dispossession. This crisis of recognition has costs that also affect the affluent. So we can't think that this is just something that a problem that the poor have. It creates spatial discontinuities that do not permit any efficient service networks. But as the urban planner Ananya Roy has written, when the system is characterized by high levels of informality, it allows informality to exist at both ends of the spectrum. And elite informality permits behind the scene rent seeking behavior that also operates outside the boundaries of legality. Again, here, all of us would have encountered this in some form. So the system has an inbuilt vested interest in perpetuating its own structural problems, depriving the Indian city of the capacity to plan and govern itself. Now, there is one view of development that sees it as formalizing the informal sector, and this could be problematic if taken too far. Urban planner Charles Stokes, in a classic paper of 1962, suggests that it would be a mistake to have a uniform approach to solving the problem of slums. For there are many kinds of slums, and each kind will call for its own solution. He conceives a 4-cell matrix for categorizing the typologies of slums. In one axis, he divides them into classes of escalator and non-escalator slums. An escalator slum is where there is a path to upward mobility. A non-escalator slum is where there are barriers of caste, class, or race that prevent upward mobility. But in the other axis, he differentiates them by attitude. And there are slums of hope and there are slums of despair. And he says this difference in attitude is far more important than the actual material condition of the slum. In a slum of hope, if granted security of tenure, people may not have the money for large value construction, but can put in small incremental improvements that over a period of time can actually transform the slum. In a slum of despair, investment in incremental improvement is less likely to happen. Physical degradation often results, social cooperation is constrained, and crime is more likely to breed. So rather than binaries such as formal, informal, we should perhaps see the challenge of who is recognized and who is unrecognized. And when we realize that hope is a crucial attitude, we have to recognize the full-blooded person who also possesses the capacity to hope. So we need to move away from the idea of the city as a technical system and move to the city as a living system. This was recognized in the earliest attempts to conceptualize metropolitan life. Although cities have existed since time immemorial, they have become a subject receiving focused study only more recently, starting in the 19th century. And this book captures some of those early thinkers. And a common thread running across most of them is that the cosmopolitan diversity of cities makes them inherently creative and free. In the village, you're always under the constricting gaze of tradition, and the anonymity of the city gives you this freedom. So, some of the essays are interesting. Max Weber writes about how the cosmopolitanism of the modern city offers new forms of market and association based on law and rights. And he says city air makes one free. George Simmel writes about the urban monk, a person who can withdraw into himself to think creatively. And my favorite is Robert Park, who comes up with this wonderful formulation that the role of the city is to foreground the moral range of deviant behavior. More recently, Jeb Brugman picks up on the thread of these early thinkers. Sorry, well, I wanted to say that Richard Sennett, who is the editor of this book, mentions in his foreword that unfortunately, urban studies has moved away from the humanism of these early thinkers and retreated into what he calls cocoons of scientific purity. Jack Brugman picks up on the humanism of these early thinkers, and he's in fact spoken at BIC many years ago on this. And he says cities are inherently creative, punching above their weight to produce a disproportionate share of GDP. In India, 35% of the population in cities and towns produces over 60% of GDP. And this happens because people in cities can leverage various economies. There are economies of scale, there are many people to connect with, economies of density, they're close at hand, easier to connect, economies of association, so you can use scale and density to form new groupings and keep innovating in these groupings, and economies of extension, where you can use scale, density, and association to connect beyond the cities. Beyond the city. One of the case studies Brugman cites in this book is Dharavi, which is classified as a slum in Mumbai. And one of the examples he gives of this leather workshop in Dharavi, which exports products to France. Brugman argues that people have the inherent capacity to leverage these economies in multiple and creative ways. So the goal should be to allow full play to this creativity where governance seeks to resolve the conflicts between these multiple strategies rather than pushing everyone, straitjacketing them into the singular strategy of a detailed master plan. This means we have to rethink the nature of the public realm, not just its transactional nature. And realize that just because a space is public, it doesn't mean that it breeds social connectivity. And that kind of a space that breeds that is what we would call civic space. So, to give you an example of two contrasting kinds of space, I'll take the atrium of a mall, and many people say, let's hang out in the mall and have fun on the weekend over there. Or the katte, which is a platform around a tree. And the Kannada word for this kind of katte is something that I really like. It's called somberi katte. Somberi, for those who don't know, it means a loafer, and it sees a value in a certain form of idleness to just stop what you're doing to connect, to just pause and connect with fellow citizens. So let's look at the contrast. The mall is a gated space, it has security guards at its entrance. The katte is open. The mall is introverted away from the city. The katte is integrated with the city. The mall has a high economic threshold. If someone who looked like a slum dweller with little money to spend, they probably would be made to not feel welcome over there. Anyone can walk into a katte. The mall is oriented towards speed. If you want to linger, you have to pay a price for it by buying something in a food court or coffee shop. The katte allows slowness. The mall assumes a passive citizen. The katte assumes a political, a connected citizen. And above all, the mall is oriented towards spectacle. It's characterized by loneliness. You can be in the middle of a crowd and intensely lonely. If you want company in the mall, you have to bring it with you. Whereas the kate is oriented towards engagement and recognition. It's a space where you can go by yourself and you can expect to recognize others and expect others to recognize you. So, if we are looking at the city as a living system predicated by civic space that encourages recognition, we have three key questions to answer. Who do we recognize? How do we recognize? And where do we recognize? So let's starting with asking who we recognize. And we must start by recognizing the crisis of recognition where the system doesn't recognize half the population of the city. So that immediately answers this question because we have to recognize everybody. And how do we recognize everybody? And that immediately raises the question is at what scale can we recognize everybody? What is the administrative unit, the spatial unit at which it makes it feasible? Clearly not possible in a city which might have many millions of people. The 74th Amendment, anticipating this, said the city should decentralize into wards. But even a ward has several lakh people in it, so it's still a difficult scale. But there is actually a scale proposed called the Area Sabha, which is derived from the idea of the population served by a polling booth, which is about 1,200 to 1,500 voters, which means about 1,500 to 2,000 residents. So an area sabha could be created by a grouping of 5 to 6 polling booths. So you're talking maximum 15 to 20,000 people. Now, in the Greater Bangalore Governance Act, the first draft of the act actually contained the provisions for area sabhas, but the act that was finally passed by the state government dropped it. So as soon as you say this important task of recognition happens at such a small scale, the question is how do you organize a city so you empower that small scale? And there's an intriguing but largely neglected principle called the principle of subsidiarity, which says in a complex layered system, you allow the lowest level in the system to do the maximum it can, and what it cannot do, it delegates upwards. Very different from the top down model of delegation that prevails in many large systems. So, what the area sabha is does the maximum it can, and it can even do urban planning at this scale. And what it can't do, it delegates upwards to the ward, and the ward, what it cannot do, delegates upwards to the city. Now, obviously, there's a level appropriate to each. You can't resolve a mass transit level except a system except at the level of the city. Waste management is found to be most effective at the ward level, but recognition is most effective at the area sabha level. So you see how you distribute functions of urban planning and management across this. So what we have to do to go back to the Pedro Roland story is to start looking at these lateral connections within the area sabha and realize that you don't need to bring in everybody. This is a very interesting study of civil resistance, nonviolent civil resistance movements across the world. And the Indian freedom struggle is also one of them. And it finds that the tipping point at which change really begins to occur is only 3.5% of the population. That's a large enough mass to be impossible to ignore. So that brings us to the question of how do we recognize? And we have to move beyond the transactional recognition that prevails in most public systems, because that is an atomized recognition looking only at individuals and not looking at lateral connections. It recognizes an incomplete person because it tends to be very function oriented, so it will not look at the right to hope. And it operates on pure rationality. And actually, the rationality is limited. And this is another very interesting study done where where a large number of people in the US were surveyed. And first, they answered questions that identified their ideological leanings. Then they were tested for their numeracy skills, their ability to understand and work with numbers, their mathematical abilities. And mathematical reasoning is about as rational as you can get. So their scores were then grouped of how they did on numeracy. And then they were asked to solve a real life problem, but first asked to solve one that didn't have political connotations to it. So they were given data of the research on a skin cream and asked to calculate how well it might do in the market. And some people got the problem right, some people got it wrong. But this mapped very closely with their numeracy skills. Those who scored high on numeracy were more likely to get it right. Then they were asked to solve a numerical problem that was politically loaded, an example of gun control. And again, some people got it right, some people got it wrong. But the interesting thing is that there's very weak correlation with numeracy skills and a very strong correlation with ideological leanings. And those with high numeracy scores had a greater ability to twist their rationalizations to make the solution they arrived at to the problem to suit their uh, ideological foundations. Even though if they had been able to look at it as a purely numerical problem, they would have seen the fallacy in their logic. But they had this ability to twist it around. And this shows that our intelligence within socio-political context works more toward affirming our agency and our community rather than any affirmation of factual truth. Philosopher Charles Taylor traces the history of this quest for significance, that for a long time we believed it came from inherited tradition. And the modern era rebelled against that, realizing justifiably that inherited tradition often carries with it unjustifiable power structures, and said instrumental reason should be the basis because everyone has the capacity to reason, and therefore we can deliberate our democracy. And Taylor suggests that we find it through engagement and dialogue, because this is something that allows us also to capture the intangible, which is beyond the capacity for our intellect to define. When the person I love returns my love, both of us affirm what love is, although we'd be hard pressed to define it. When my friend and I laugh at the same joke, we both affirm joy and humor. A public realm that rests on pure rationality, on the hope of pure rationality, filters out the transcendental and pushes it into the private realm. The Mexican poet and diplomat Octavio Paz, in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, pointed out that the modern era is the first in human history that pushed transcendentalism out of the public realm and into the private realm to assert it is a purely private affair. And by privatizing transcendence, we exacerbate tribal loyalties and furies. So the task of our time is to learn how to publicly debate transcendental value without resorting to orthodoxy and its defense. So basically, we should ask, do we recognize people just as marchers, or do we recognize them as dancers? Now, this requires that we shift from the direct gaze of rationality to the indirect gaze of poetry. Writer Italo Calvino writes about how early in his career as a writer, he found an increasing gulf between the lightness that good writing has and the heaviness of the world he wanted to write about. And the world is extremely complex. So he said, I need to include this, and I have to include this, and I have to include that. And finally, he felt he was pinned down by this mass of information and he couldn't move. And he says it was as if writing implicated an inevitable state of petrification. And then once he thought of petrification, he thought of the Greek myth of Medusa, who can turn people into stone just by looking at them. And the person who slays Medusa is Perseus, who embodies lightness. He has wings on his sandals and he can walk on clouds. And he is able to slay Medusa, never looking at her directly, but through the reflection in a polished shield. And Calvino says to him, this is an allegory of the poet's relationship of the world, refusing to be captured purely by the direct rational gaze and privileging the indirect gaze of metaphor. Now, you may think this is a purely philosophical argument having little to do with politics. But actually, in our own history, in India's history, we have one of the prime examples of how this can be effectively deployed. We tend to value Gandhi for his ethics and politics, but have actually undervalued his poetics, particularly his ability to transform the spirit of Swaraj into metaphors such as the spinning wheel or salt. This imparted lightness and accessibility to the message, made it comprehensible. It lent a sense of unity to what was actually a very diverse set of struggles. But above all, these metaphors provoked embodied action, discovery possible through experience. So you could actually step into these metaphors and enact yourself and actually feel it and feel the message that they conveyed. So I don't have any specific proposals today on the metaphors we may deploy in urban local governance, but I just wish to point out the importance of deploying our poetic creativity within our politics. One way to approach this is how space captures memory. I first became aware of this in writing by historian Francis Yates, who talks about the orators of ancient Rome who had to remember long, complex speeches and they didn't have paper to write notes on. So they used the architecture of the space where they were going to speak as a memory device. They would go in there to compose the speech and they would say, this door stands for the first point, this column next to it for the second point, this niche next to it for the third point, etc. So Yates says that we don't just receive meaning from architecture and space, we actively write meaning into it. And I found this intriguing, but it made sense many years later, reading an essay by Primo Levi on his own house, where he also recalls the same skill of the Roman orators, but then goes on to say, this technique would never work for me in my own home, for every corner is already occupied by authentic memories which would interfere with the fictitious memories this technique demands. So when we use a space, we write memory into it. And the space becomes a way of recalling that memory or reliving it. So in fact, if you were to try to recall your childhood, you would perhaps be better served by remembering the house in which you grew up. And that might tell you more than the family photo album, because the photo album would only show you what can be tangibly perceived, but the memories within the house can make you also remember the intangible. So perhaps we can think of our cities as sites of memories and define the right to the city as the right to inscribe memory on public space without it being subject to erasure by others. Because this is what happens to half the population who are not recognized by the city. They are subject to their memories being erased. So that brings us to the last question, where do we recognize? And this is a pressing question given that the establishment actively suppresses activity they consider even remotely resistant, let alone subversive. In cities across India, there is a push by both courts and law and order machinery to cite public order and suppress protest by pushing it into sanitized zones. So, this is the example we have in Bangalore, where protests can only happen inside a walled enclosure that is segregated both from public view and the protagonist one is protesting against. So one will have to seek spaces that are relatively under the radar. One possibility lies in not going directly into the physical space of the city, but using maps. And there are clues in the history of world maps dating from the 8th century onwards, where initially the maps are vague, imprecise, with large gaps where detail is missing. And then, as the capacity for transoceanic navigation increases, the maps get more accurate. And then, surveying technique adds further accuracy. And then, finally, now we have the fine grained detail and accuracy of aerial photography and satellite mapping. Now, one way to look at it is this is a development in the science and technology of cartography. But another way to look at it is that maps grow richer and more accurate as they absorb the memories of journeys undertaken. And that is what they are reflecting. So the map can be a representation of the space we inhabit, both in its spatial configuration as well as a repository for memory. There is a precedent of maps being used for political resistance. Hamara Bachpan, an NGO in Bhubaneswar, has been working with children in slums to assert their rights through maps. In this case, children draw maps of their neighborhood to assess the services available to them, including identifying gaps in services that should be there but are not. In another case, young girls map the unsafe and safe spaces in their neighborhood. And these maps have effected change. The advantage we have now is maps can be digital, and this contains many advantages. They can be layered, with each layer containing different information. They can be easily shared. They can be easily annotated and modified, broadening the number of people who can work with the map, and you can fit them into a device you can hold in your hand. And data can be multimedia. So imagine this process as starting with an area survey and how the master plan claims to represent it. And then we can overlay this with the ground realities where people say, no, I am here also, although the master plan doesn't recognize me. And then you can start overlaying it with memory, anecdotal histories, artistic representations, etc. And then you can recognize patterns in this, so you're starting to build the lateral connections. And you might have started with smaller territories, but that you can expand it to more territories. And then you can overlay visions and hopes of the city, a sort of people's master plan. And eventually they can be catalysts to actual physical events. We tend to either operate digitally or physically, but I think we need systems that bind the two. And with this layering, we can actually build the lateral connections that make us, that are harder to disrupt because they're developing under the radar, they're not in direct confrontation. And finally, when it comes to physical confrontation, or physical politics, it is something that is more interwoven and harder to disrupt. Now, this immediately raises the problem of a digital divide, but I would argue that this is not really a problem. And I'd like to cite something that happened in 1995 when people across the country started saying Ganesha statues are drinking milk from a spoon if you offer it. I don't want to get into whether that's true or not true. What I want to point out is this started somewhere in the morning hours, I don't know where, but by noon it was a nationwide phenomenon. Now, how did this happen in 1995? There was no internet, there were no mobile phones in India. There were only landlines, and landline penetration was less than 10%, and that were largely in urban areas. And that was because there was a well-designed intermediary, the public call office. Those of us old enough to will remember them as being very ubiquitous in our cities, but unfortunately they died when mobile phones became equally ubiquitous. So it is actually not the problem of the digital divide, it's actually a design challenge of how do we design the appropriate intermediaries. So in conclusion, I will say that we must act in this belief that the future is in our hands. While the powers that be might resist us when we engage with them to debate their proposals, there is nothing in the way of us coming together on our own to imagine our city. If there is a sufficient number of us doing that, and remember, we only need 3.5%, we become a center of gravity that is hard to ignore. And we don't need to bring everyone onto the same line of thinking. As Brugman says, let people have their multiple strategies. We just resolve conflicts between those strategies. In the process of doing this, we not only affirm our city, we also affirm who we are. And we must seriously examine whether we can imagine the kind of city we want to be without simultaneously imagine the kind of people we want to be. The cities are made by people, and we need to imagine both. And we have to work towards establishing the networks that sustain those two acts of imagining. Thank you.
Thank you, Prem. I think that left us with a lot of points to chew on. This is a topic that definitely resonated with me, and based on the faces I see, I think it's resonated with a lot of you as well. So as part of our work at Urvani, we've been working with citizens, looking at the civic space, looking at engagement and helping people strengthen agency into and find those opportunities for problem solving. And in the last few years, especially, and we are kind of seeing there are a lot of changes in the civic space itself, right? And every city, and especially from Bangalore's perspective, there are a handful of activists. You know, we will always find a tunnel road or an equivalent to protest about. And then there are a slightly larger bunch of local residents, active citizens who are doing stuff in their neighborhood. They're, complaining about drains overflowing or trying to get the road fixed, etc., etc. The rest of us are either watching Netflix or stuck in traffic. So this sort of seems to be a general, like, and especially post COVID, you can kind of see this trend. And that would kind of lead me to the first question. And I thought I'd divide the conversation two parts. One, let's just really understand this issue of identity and belonging. What makes somebody a Bangalorean or a citizen of any whichever city they're part of? And the second part about, let's talk about behavior, social behavior, civic behavior, and so on. So that would be my first question. How do you get, especially cities as they urbanize, the bulk of the population are new to the city. They're not old timers necessarily. So what does this mean? How do you really assimilate into the city? There's a higher chance, or it's easier to be isolated, or you're stuck with your home, your workplace, and maybe you go to a restaurant or a movie. But really, the kind of the Somberi Kattes and the kind of common spaces that we see are much fewer. People patronize them not so often. So how do you build the sense of belonging then?
One is that the sense of belonging, to say, am I a Bangalorean, doesn't start with some definition of identity. Identity comes out of a process to do something meaningful. Identity, when seen as a predetermined solution by which meaning can be easily constructed, gets to be problematic. So we need to have some discussion along those lines. Second is we need to build awareness of the city as a living system. And that is why I say it is necessary to talk about the philosophy rather than just jumping into action. I was talking about some of these points with a friend, and he had a certain impatience. He said, yeah, this is fine as philosophy, but what's the practical plan? So I feel if we jump straight into action without reflecting on these, we will spend a lot of effort on unproductive paths. So we need some clarity on this, and we need to realize that the city offers this wide range of creative possibility. If you're only recognized by it, if you can actually make connections with others in it. And so to build awareness of that. And these are struggles for the long haul. For the short term, you have to make people realize the costs of apathy. The fact that because we produce informality, we allow elite informality, and we perpetuate this inefficient system of rent-seeking behavior and an incapacity of the city to plan and govern itself. The fact that because of informality, we can't have efficient service networks because the discontinuities in spatial pattern are too high. So it requires action on multiple fronts, but eventually there's a bit of a patient process that we have to get into, because in cities, the kind of things that Jeb Brugman talked about, he talks about people leveraging these economies and something emerging over time. You don't start with what is possible. You allow a process of life to unfold and allow things to emerge. And we need to have a system that opens things up, because otherwise the natural systems are suppressed. Now, again, this might sound very philosophical, but it is actually how we intuitively live. If you sought to find friends by first making a master plan of friendship, the odds are you wouldn't have friends. You have friends just by engaging with them, and then, allowing things to unfold. And then suddenly one day you have this solid core of friendship that didn't exist at all in your first meeting. So there's a patient struggle of realizing that the city is a living system, and getting into what are the fundamentals of life in the urban metropolis and how that can unfold, and making people aware of it. And as I said, we'll have to approach this very poetically, because the rational argument gets bogged down in complexity too fast. And this is something I'm struggling with, but I I think we need to develop it just as the way Gandhi was able to do it in the Indian freedom movement. We need to figure out a strategy of how to do it.
You did mention apathy to the local, right? Uh, so beyond apathy, I mean, one concern I have is, which is also maybe more visible now, is a cynicism. Nothing can change, right? And that's something more, at least people are more vocal about it. They were always cynics. Is that, what do you think about it? And my second part is also, is this disconnect with local, is it also related to our internalized belief in a hierarchy? Like we think, in fact, I've met a lot of people who actually, may not be very familiar with the governance systems, who think that a corporator reports to an MLA reports to an MP, right? There's a certain hierarchy in this imagination because they are in charge of a larger area. So is that something, could that be a reason why we ignore the local?
Let me respond to your this nothing can change. We live within what I'll call two circles, our circle of influence and our circle of concern. And the problem is we tend to get preoccupied with our circle of concern, that we do not even think of acting on our circle of influence. So I might say, I want peace in the world, but there's nothing I can do about it, so I become apathetic. But I can actually act peaceably with my neighbors, right? And you're not going to get peace in the world unless it gets ingrained as an attitude at the local level. So it's actually not whether you can solve the system. If you start with that question, you'll never do anything. But you recognize what is in your control and just take those small steps. So just try and make your circle of influence wider by a few millimeters every day. And that is actually what hope is. Hope is not a vision of some future. Hope is a capacity one should have. It's like a muscle that needs to be exercised. Otherwise, it atrophies. And hope is just having that ability to take one step. And because you have this, you are in your own humanity and you realize the full dimensions of it. As I said, do we recognize dancers or marchers? And if you're a dancer, then you have the capacity to deal with those issues. It's like the tribal who goes into an unfamiliar part of the forest and can still find his way back because he has learned how to read the signs. He knows how to make sense of the path of the sun and the wind and the stars and the smell, and therefore can navigate in unknown territory. And actually, we intuitively hold those signs within us. We have the ability, we are born with it. But we somehow abandon it and get into this world of rationality, get paralyzed by this sphere of concern. And I think that's why we don't act. So the first step is to realize your own humanity, that you are. I mean, another argument I use sometimes is to say that every one of us is a miracle, because we are actually a physical body in which every particle is governed by the laws of physics. Yet those laws of physics, by some process that science is yet to explain and may never explain, have a consciousness that can dream and ideate and play and wonder. And so our consciousness actually defines all the categories of a miracle. It is real, we know it just by being alive. It is wondrous because of all the things that we can do. And we don't need it occurs without any apparent explanation. So when I say the recognition and full dimensional, recognize the right to hope and all that, we have to make that the fundamental of not just a governance, but of citizenship. And we're not going to solve the problem unless we start working along those lines.
Don't you think we in Bangalore are hopeful at some level? I mean, that's how we've been dealing with all the issues we've been having in the last so many years, right?
Some of us are, some of us are not. I've had people in my moments of activism. I remember in the early days when we founded Civic, and Someone who was a friend told me, what you're doing is useless. It's like pissing in the wind. So there are, sorry to use that crude language, but there are people who think that way also, but that's going to exacerbate the problem. We are trying to act for change without thinking about who we are.
Thanks for the wonderful talk. I would like to refer to one of your slides where you gave a figure of 3.5% as the tipping point. Bengaluru's population is 1.4 million, the latest figures.
11.
Oh, sorry, nearly 14 million. I'm sorry. Yeah, I beg your pardon. So 3.5% of that, I think, roughly translates to about 5 lakh people, 500,000. Where do you see 500,000 people in Bangalore coming together for a common cause, especially in the context of what happened recently, where Biocon's chairman, Mrs. Kiran Mazumdar Shah, raised her voice against the state of roads and all that. But eventually, at the end of it, what we saw was that she went and presented bouquets and gifts to the chief minister and the deputy chief minister, and that's the end of it. So I'm sorry, I don't mean to be cynical or pessimistic, but somehow I feel the whole framework in which the discourse has been framed tonight is slightly out of touch with reality. I would rather have a discourse where people are encouraged to come to peace, come to peace with the fact that we as citizens are completely disempowered, probably intellectually emasculated, and we should find a way to come to peace with that, rather than again harping on themes like hope and all that, which is kind of false hope in my view. So I think a better course of action would be to figure ways of how to come to terms with the present reality. Also, if I add a small rider, when we talk of people, there are two kinds of people now in Bangalore. One is the older generation, probably who are a spent force, and the other part is the Generation Z, the millennials and the digital natives, whose minds have already been conditioned by social media and all that. They are not going to respond positively to any of this kind of discourse. So how are you going to deal with this reality? Thank you.
Should we ask somebody else who wants to, has a on the same vein? If somebody else wants to say, and then we can address it.
Every issue, I feel, has both pros and cons. The activists take sometimes the political ideology based also either towards the project or against the project, including the tunnel project, what you mentioned, or the stray dogs issue. So the activists have to understand that if there is no alternate solution, then just protesting all the time is also of no use. If the tunnel project has an alternate route, then that can be protested, or at least they have to suggest the alternate.
Thank you. Maybe you can respond.
Take this, because that's quite a lot to start with. If just go through a thought experiment. If sometime in the 14th or 15th centuries, you'd spoken to anyone in the world and talked about this idea you have called democracy, they would have laughed at you and said, this has never existed in history. It is a foolish dream. And if you trace how democracy actually came to be, it started with the very lonely work of a handful of philosophers. And then they were able to put it in a way that the idea slowly got viral. I'd say today, the capacity to make ideas viral is far greater than what it was in the 15th century. So I would strongly resist that if you look at this overwhelming distortion of the system, it doesn't necessarily mean that all is lost. And it is possible to change, and you have to, because are you willing to live with the kind of person being the kind of person who gives up so easily? That's the question I asked myself. That I want to be the kind of person who's filled with wonder, curiosity, hope, all of those things. And I want my city to reflect the possibility to do all of that. Second thing, getting 3.5%, yes, but I emphasize the point that you don't need to get them all on a common cause. And you don't start with saying, let's all do this together, implement this plan together. You start with, let's just recognize each other. And you look at the systems by which you can do that. One of the slides I had, but I cut it out because of the constraint of time, was this. There's this book by one of the seminal thinkers on urban studies, Jane Jacobs. And she asks the question, what kind of a problem is a city? And she cites a scientific paper written by this person called Warren Weaver, who classified scientific problems into 3 categories. He said there's organized simplicity, where everything can be captured in a conceptual model. There's disorganized complexity, where the system is so disaggregated, only statistical techniques apply. And then there's organized complexity, where order emerges from within the system, from the bottom up, through the way parts of the system interact with each other and the environment. And then Jacobs in her book lays out in a fair amount of detail how a city is a third kind of problem. You just make these connections with each other, and it leads to, like, one small example she gives is that the block she lives in Manhattan, there's a hardware store where everyone in that street knows that shop owner. So he sells hardware, that's his business, but the service he offers is that if you have a guest coming to stay with you and you're going to be away at work, you leave your key with that person. And the guest comes in there, shows some identification, takes the key and goes in. And she says it's actually these kind of small things that are the lifeblood of a city. And you have to design cities, and they happen at pedestrian level interactions. So you have to design a city. It's possible to design a city so that these kind of things go viral. So I'd say we need to get into that. And to the question about protest, yes, if the only thing we do with protest, if I said we have to have the capacity to hope, so the activist also has to lay down the basis for hope. So I oppose that. To take the tunnel road as an example, I don't think you have to come up with another example that is a large project which is equivalent or alternative to that. The problem with the tunnel road is it won't solve congestion, it will only relocate it. I'll just give you an example. Let's say there's a junction which keeps getting congested, and it can handle only X cars per minute. You put a flyover, so suddenly there are 4x cars per minute passing down that junction. But there's another junction downstream along that same road which was handling the traffic, but now suddenly it's got a larger volume, so you only redistribute congestion. So the tunnel road, the exit and entrance ramps will be points of horrific congestion, leave alone the equity of who can afford to use the tunnel. And why should something like this happen outside the vacuum of a master plan, outside the vacuum of a multimodal transit analysis? Those are the big questions. I don't think, and I think I'm entitled to say that's a system by which the city should operate, not that I protest only if I have an alternative.
Thanks, Prem. If I could just reflect on these two viewpoints, I suspect it was this point of view wasn't so commonplace maybe 15 years ago. My observation has been like I found people much more hopeful, much more constructive. And I'm just wondering if it is something perhaps in the last few years, perhaps post-pandemic, we've also got exhausted. There are studies actually to show that people have become more disconnected, or civic behavior actually has gotten worse. People are more rude out there in public spaces. Or is it also the current political climate where we are just being pushed back or distracted with so many things and we're just kind of switching off?
We are allowing ourselves to be distracted, is what I would say. I think we just have to start with the question. We jump to the sphere of concern and then get paralyzed by it. And we don't have to look at the sphere of influence, which is the capacity to change myself. And if people say, no, the system is terrible, there is no hope and all that, I do ask myself, do I want to be that kind of person who does not have the capacity to hope? Can I have the capacity to hope and at least I'll start with one other person who can hope with me and I'll build up slowly over time. So it requires that patience of organized complexity. We have to switch from this linear logic of I can solve the problem, I can have a conceptual, and get into the organized complexity model of which is non-linear, which says I will just step into the processes of life because that's who I inherently am. And I will take it one day at a time from there.
Is it also an issue of the lack of time? Like you talked about slowness in your presentation. The daily grind has kind of leaving us with very little time. For an average person, spending more time in traffic, more time in dealing with the operational issues of daily life than ever, right? Work is also much more than earlier. There is more of burnout, etc. Could that be a reason that we are not really allowing ourselves the luxury to sit back and reflect and ponder and actually reimagine or envision our cities?
No doubt that's a real problem, but I wouldn't see that as the Austrian poet Rainer Maria Rilke has this letters to a young poet where someone is asking him how to write poetry, and is giving advice to this young soldier who wants to write poetry. And he answers one of these letters, which is asking, how do I write poetry? And he says, you're asking the wrong question. Don't say, how do I write poetry? First ask, must I write poetry? And if you spontaneously answer, I must, the how will resolve itself. So I think I was also caught up in this grind. I was caught up in a thing where I over-intellectualized everything. So I started very slowly of maybe just snatching a few minutes of slowness here and there. And then you build up from there.
I think that's good advice. Any other questions?
So my question had to do with the point that you raised in your presentation that just stirred my curiosity. And you mentioned that you quoted another thinker who said that cities can also foreground the moral ground for deviant behavior, the moral range of deviant behavior. And I was struck by that because deviance meaning we're deviating from the social norm, that's how I interpreted it. And I could also see myself as a single woman who's chosen to be child-free, situated in that idea of deviance. So I wanted to know more about that and how you see that being enacted in a city like Bangalore.
As I repeated earlier, I can't give you a sort of answer of how that can be activated at a systemic level across the city. But I'm just saying, start with yourself and say, I don't need to give in to this pressure that I should not be deviant, as long as I'm within that moral range that I'm ethically relating to others. And visibly live that life and demonstrate it. But I think it is important because we are, the contrast to that in that book that I cited was the constricting gaze of tradition in the village. And it's not that it's totally absent in the city. There are aspects of it in the city also, except in the city, you have an escape into anonymity. And there are all kinds of possibilities if you rethink the conventional frameworks So, for example, you said you speak as a woman. There's these wonderful studies by the sociologist Shilpa Phadke, who sees that in Mumbai, women are labeled both at work and at home. Because at work, you said you're a secretary or you're this or that. And at home, they are their wife, mother, daughter-in-law, and they're living in joint families. So actually, for privacy, they step into public space. And in public space, when they're able to do that as women together, it's actually mind-boggling. There's a wonderful film called Lady Special, which is a film of a commuter train from Churchgate to Andheri, which is reserved for women. And the life you see there is incredible. You'll see the illustration of that line, the moral range of deviant behavior. And those women say, this is where I can be free. I can be just who I am. So there'll be one group singing bhajans, there'll be one group doing other things. And they have a blast, and that 1 hour train journey preserves their sanity in this high pressure, constrained existence they lead. So I think you have to search for those spaces. And I cited Italo Calvino, and let me cite him again. He says the inferno of hell is not an inferno that we might anticipate after we die. It is one that we are already immersed in. It's part of life. And he says we have two choices. One is to become so much a part of the inferno that we no longer recognize it. But the other is to develop the sensitivity to recognize in the middle of that inferno what is not inferno and work to give it space. So it's that kind of I don't have a very direct answer, but it's more the attitude of hope versus despair that I also talked about, and living in hope, and hope as a capacity you keep exercising.
There's a question there, and then there was, yeah, sure.
Good evening, sir. Referring to your presentation, the early part where you mentioned development of lateral relationships without the direct influence of the state. I've been organizing a think tank, and we've been working on that lines for quite some time. And what role do you think students would have in doing something like this? Because in my experience, students have the capacity to solve a large number of problems, and they have the enthusiasm to do so, but they are not taken seriously, and the resources for them, availability of resources is a huge problem. So how can we bridge that gap in solving that issue?
And if I could just add one part to his question, which is also related, is this imagine. You talked about all this reimagining and radically thinking about the concept of recognition, right? This is in event like this, a whole bunch of us are now getting to think about these. But how can we make it possible for the larger citizenry and these ideas to be part of public discourse by starting right early, maybe in schools, colleges? How would we do that? So kind of related in a way.
Yeah, many years ago, I was invited by an architect friend to hear a talk by one of his classmates who was living in the US. And this guy taught in, I think it was the University of Kansas, if I remember right. And his talk consisted of two parts. One was he presented a design studio that he was teaching in the college. But the other thing, and this was the days before computer renderings and all that, and he did wonderful watercolor renderings. And so he used to freelance doing renderings for the commercial practices in the city. And he did these renderings of the building. And I asked him, I said, the work he showed in his studio was full of creative energy and imagination. Whereas the renderings he showed were wonderful renderings, but the architecture they represented was very banal and ordinary. which we see in the large mass of the building. And I said those practices producing that architecture are probably largely graduates of the local college. So the system seems to have this capacity for amnesia. That once the students change their context, so first, I think that's the thing that we need to recognize. Firstly, as Aristotle said, the goal of education is not to fill a vessel, but to kindle a flame. So I think education has to focus on building the individual, not building the subject. And that's a mistake we make. And once we recognize ourselves as individuals, another lovely line I like to quote is by the poet, philosopher, and priest John O'Donoghue, who said, one of the sad things is that so many people are fearful of the wonder of their own presence. And therefore they try to hang their hat on an external, something external that other people have already determined for them. So I think it just needs to start with that. And you don't need to start with large numbers. And you don't need huge resources. Your body is enough of a resource if you look at the wonder of your own presence. So just start building. Maybe you just need 3 or 4 friends, and you start reflecting on. You might start with no plan, but you just keep asking the question, who are we? What can we do? And take it from there. And viral ideas started that way. And I think we need to persist with that.
It's definitely a case for actually making schooling and colleges less stressful and less intense. Whenever I see kids, they're all like busy cramming up. They have assignments and tests, and there's just so much. It seemed much. We seem to have more free time earlier. So, yeah.
So one of your slides actually sparked this off. I came for a talk by Amitav Ghosh, and he talked about that indigenous people are really the most empowered to manage their environment, right? So I was just thinking about what you said in one of your slides, which was electoral zones, which are much smaller, easier to manage. Is that thing implemented? Is that idea implemented? And is it on the cards? Because I think, smaller areas managed by locals and people, I think that could spell for something, otherwise you just have a macro plan, you have everything, on a larger scale, and nothing just comes to pass.
Maybe you could explain about Bangalore's experiment with, I think we had it once long ago, there were some,
Probably more experience.
It's like way back, I heard 20 years ago, there was an experiment and it did happen in Indiranagar. There was a big sabha and all that. Yeah. You want to consider?
There is, as I said, the new Greater Bangalore Governance Act, the first draft of the bill actually had area sabhas, allowing urban planning at the area sabha and ward level also. But all that got axed. So as I said, the system is interested in perpetuating its own inefficiencies, because an efficient system will not allow elite informality. So I think Hyderabad has recognized area sabhas. I don't have data on how effectively they have been allowed to operate, because the 74th Amendment recognizes wards, for example, which is a big step from what existed before. But wards are not empowered. So it's a sort of definition on paper that conforms technically to the letter of the amendment, but totally ignores its spirit. So I don't think we're going to get the government to change that, but we have to just step in and start doing it ourselves.
Thanks. There's one hand there and one there, maybe.
Someone has the mic already.
Can I speak? Yeah. Hi, Prem. I always knew you were a philosopher. I didn't know you were a poet. You learn something every day. I get the part about critical mass, 3.5%. The other thing that impressed me was the despair and hope triangle, and the lateral connect. However, I don't see myself living long enough for that to happen. So the question here is that if it's based on emotion and based on a human dimension, that this relationship has to be cultivated. Why not anger? Because anger is a powerful force. Most changes in the world, revolutions and changes have happened with an element of anger. Even our Gandhiji's movement, ahimsa of course, but there was an element of anger, at least at some levels, which motivated the change, which got people to think and got people to curse together. So ultimately, it is a question of communication, or of what you are communicating to the horizontal people. I don't know, but I just thought maybe anger, controlled anger, let's call it controlled anger, is possibly emotion that needs to be tapped into, because we are past logical thinking and rational thinking and friendly chats with the administration.
I think Gandhi is the best example over there. And I think his philosophy of ahimsa came from drawing a rather strong dividing line between what can actually be two states that can easily merge. One is anger, where you act to enforce your own emotion upon others. And the other, which is an equally vehement form of resistance, is to say, this is an injustice I will not tolerate. But the point he was making is that if you go to the latter, then you say that you are still preserving the basis of your humanness. And I think it's the Indian freedom struggle is actually very interesting, because it's the first, one of the few freedom movements that was not based on nationalism. It was based on Swaraj. And actually Swaraj is very clearly aligned with what I'm saying. Swa means self and Raj means rule. So it means that there is an autonomy of the self, and that autonomy is sacred. And therefore, you will not tolerate injustice. And whatever injustice can be forced upon you, that autonomy, if you are aware of it and hold on to it, cannot be taken away. You might not be able to act effectively, and that's where collective resistance is necessary. But definitely be intolerant of injustice. But think about whether you take it to anger. Because the problem with anger is, like, I've heard people say that I'm not going to be a hypocrite, I'm going to be brutally honest. And the problem when you're brutally honest is people only remember the brutality and not the honesty. So you actually undermine the lateral networks that you might build. But definitely an intolerance to what you're being subjected to, which has silenced you so far.
That is also a moral position. Do you think there's an equivalent at a local level?
Absolutely.
Right. There are two questions and we are running out of time, so maybe we can take that together.
Must say thank you for that brilliant and very comprehensive bundle of thoughts that you put together. I think you've given us several anchoring points for envisioning a better future. And as a way forward, I think you're suggesting that in democracy, as all of us know, that critical mass or numbers matter. And building that numbers is through solidarity. Now, how do you actually build solidarity in a sustainable fashion? Because temporary solidarities can be built by an issue, a problem, or a common enemy. Whereas lasting solidarity will require building identities that transcend the divisive identities that is in abundance today. So how do we really build that? That identity can be Bangalorean or a Mumbaiker or whatever that is. But how do we actually make that happen in reality? How do we transcend the current environment of multiple and very purposive divisive identities that kind of create what is a city?
Right. We take the other question as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So we talk about living spaces. There is a widespread middle class anxiety about disorder and infrastructure. How do we ensure sort of how civic activism doesn't reproduce class and caste inequalities at a time when use of public space and streets is deemed sort of illegal? And can these spatial interventions be truly political, or do they risk becoming symbolic gestures for structural changes?
Okay, there's a lot to unpack in both those questions, but I'll try. Um, I said during my talk that if we try and focus on projects and build common cause on them, but that has limited um, ability to actually change things, because projects tend to be location and class stratified. So the thrust of my argument was that we need to just start with recognition, and we need to start documenting that recognition. So you start with, okay, this is the neighborhood I live in. Like if you start with an area sabha, and you say who has to be recognized as someone who belongs here. Don't start with what that belonging is, but just say I recognize them. Then once I recognize them, I say, okay, I have to recognize them in the fullness of their being, that their capacity to hope. And obviously not everyone will act in the same way. So I emphasize Brugman's argument that allow multiple strategies and try to resolve conflicts between them. And it's only once you've started building some connectivity and common belonging over there, and then you overlay it with anecdotes and history and memory and all of that. And I think it's only at that stage you can actually start making the action more concrete and public, but you have to lay this groundwork before. Otherwise, you focus just on that vertical axis between citizen and state, where there's an asymmetry of power and there'll be a limit to what you can do. Regarding your question, I think we have to, it's a longer dialogue, but we have to, the first thing we have to do is create the feedback loop of what's happening. I'll give you a lovely example of that, which is not directly related to urban life. But we were doing a project for this large software company, and they faced a problem of people wasting food in the cafeteria. And they did all the rational arguments. You shouldn't waste food. Take a second helping if you want. Take a smaller first helping, all of that. It didn't have much impact. Then someone had a brainwave of creating this feedback loop. So every day after lunch, they weighed the amount of wasted food. And they published a graph of that in every elevator lobby in the building. And once that feedback loop was created, wastage dramatically came down. So we need to start making these feedback loops more apparent. So to realize, as I said, that because we de-recognize half the system, all of us, including the affluent, are affected badly by it. Because we can't have efficient service networks. And by allowing informality at the base, we allow informality at the top. So we are perpetuating a system where the city cannot plan or govern itself. And we are facing the cost of that. Whether it's you're stuck in traffic or whether you can't get water, or in various ways. So to create these feedback loops and through that change the perception of what order is. And actually the Indian city has a amazingly resilient capacity for order, which is different from the idea of the precisely zoned and managed city like the way Western urban planning does. So I'll give you one example that comes to mind, but you'll find many examples of this across Indian cities. Manik Chowk in Ahmedabad. It's a large open square. And if you go there within the day, it's filled with vendors selling stuff. It's a very thriving market. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the vendors start disappearing. And a new set of people come in and it transforms into an eating place. And that continues till about 10, 11 at night. Then the food places start disappearing and people drag their beds into the, and it becomes a sleeping place. I imagine one space is cycling through 3 different land uses in a 24-hour cycle. And it's resilient and it's been going on for years and years. And it's still going on today. So, I mean, that's a capacity for order. That's not a predefined order, sustained by the living systems of the city. So I think we need to just have a debate of what we mean by order and change that. And if you look at your own life, as I gave that example of friendship, we all have that capacity in our own life. So we need to make that argument go viral.
Just want to reflect on, at a point where the majority of this country is actually urban, including peri-urban and wannabe urban areas. According to the UNESCO definition, actually, that is the case. It's not as much rural anymore, right? So at this point, all of these aspects are more critical than ever. And the presentation was fabulous. And there's so many different aspects that came out. And I think all of us have gained a lot of perspective from that. There are a couple of takeaways for me personally. One was the need for a metaphor or something that all of us can grasp, and as we work towards a better Bangalore, like what is it that can represent all these different interests and what we are fighting for, or what sort of vision we have for the city. I think that would be something for us all to work on. And the second, of course, was the point about it's actually doing that brings that sense of belonging. It's not just about the fact that you're born there or what your identity is. Once you start working and engaging with people, having more conversations, volunteering locally, etc., that's when it actually you create that identity of who belongs to that place. So I think these were my personal favorites, but there were just so many different things. And thank you so much, Prem, for this wonderful talk.
Thank you.